Okay, so our next speaker, we have Kaileigh La Belle. She is a third-year history major with a minor in sexuality studies, and she hopes to continue studying these fields in graduate school. In her talk today, she is going to speak on the sport of Mensur, I think it's pronounced, also known as academic fencing, or just fencing between students at universities, mostly in Germany. And she will be presenting on how the body in particular has provided its participants with classed and gendered social status symbols. So I'm happy to present Kaileigh and her speech, or her talk titled Mensur and Masculinity.
Thank you so much, Zanita. So let me just bring up the presentation. So yes, my presentation is on German fencing culture in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I owe a bit of a debt to the history of the body, history 3120A or O. This is a project that I produced for that class, and it questioned how we treat the body academically. We tend to treat the body and the history of the body more as a subject matter and not as a methodology. And that is what brings me to my thesis. So my thesis essentially examines how bodily discourses allowed the emerging middle class in the 19th century to perform something as subjective as national belonging in a way that was concrete and legible to their contemporaries. This is made possible by elements of the body, such as the medicalization of the body. When something is made scientific, we tend to think of it as fact, and the social constructions that we etched onto the body are now treated as fact. So as such, the body becomes an indispensable methodological lens, which reveals how discourses on class, gender, and nation relate to power. This is a methodology referred to as biopower, created by Foucault, and it effectively argues that the way that we carry our bodies, perform our bodies, and the meanings that we inscribed onto our physical flesh and bone are related intrinsically to institutions of power like race, class, the law, the medical field, et cetera, et cetera. So I intend to demonstrate this by examining how gender and class are socially constructed and made meaningful through the body and heavily dependent on the concept of honor. We can see this in the point d'honneur system and chivalry. This honor translates into respectability, acting as symbolic currency and granting access to institutions of power. So this presentation is based very heavily on the works of Ute Febvre, who produced a lot of work on how Mensur functions symbolically, mainly connecting it to gendered expressions of violence as well as class expressions of gendered violence. So first, a little bit of historical context. So Germany is a relatively new nation, only unifying in 1871. The bourgeoisie, or the middle class, also appeared during the Industrial Revolution, which for simplistic purposes, we're going to really attach to the 19th century, even though it emerged at the end of the 18th century. Germany, as a new nation, is also a rapidly industrializing nation. It kind of goes back and forth for top place between England. And as such, there is a new emerging middle class in Germany that is really seeking to legitimize itself at the same time that Germany as a nation is seeking to legitimize itself. And they do this through each other. So where does fencing come into this? So fencing is highly symbolic. It was very much attached to a historic university curriculum that emerged in the Middle Ages, around the Renaissance. And it was an indispensable part of a young nobleman's higher education. And as such, it's attached to serving the state. Nobles were going to university, getting higher education in order to learn how to be good generals, learn how to be good statesmen, learn how to be good representatives for their territories. And so fencing becomes something that is very much connected to noble culture and very much connected to producing for the state. Fencing is also highly attached to a romantic German past. You see the sword come up in a lot of romantic art, and it's genuinely attached to things like chivalry. We can see this in a number of artistic styles that emerge in the 19th century that are primarily consumed by the middle class. So as such, Mensur really takes on a new meaning in what's called the Mensur revival period, which dates from 1860 to 1918. This is when most people attending universities are no longer of strictly the noble class, but are of the middle class. There's a trend here. And so Mensur is attached primarily to fraternities. And these fraternities usually boasted nationalist positions, arguing that their members could serve the state in ways that other people couldn't because they had earned their respectability and they had fought for their place. And we can see here that, that respectability becomes a social currency. So just as a little kind of crash course in what Mensur looked like, it was not based on any malice. It was based on proving your worth. And worth here is synonymous with a number of things, and it is created by a number of things, but it was meant to convey a comradeship between yourself and those in your fraternity. It was meant to demonstrate your courage to be able to stand and submit to this violence. It was meant to demonstrate your physical as well as mental hardiness in that you were able to fight properly. It is very much attached to a nationalist position because these were all traits that are associated with state service, sacrifice for the greater good, hardiness. These are states that were valid, or these are characteristics that are valuable to the state. They are also very much associated with the middle class. We see the middle class boasting positions of restraint, of orderliness, of comradeship. And so again, they're very much constructing one after the other. So at this point, previously most duels were performed by nobles on the basis of nobility and noble honor becoming questioned. By 1890, which is kind of smack dab in the middle of this revival period, we see a total shift in who is performing duels. Of the 8,000 duels that occurred annually in Germany, that's a rough estimate, 5% were done under the context of Mensur. So this is a total reversal of who's using Mensur to express what. So let's get into the body. First thing that we really have to look at is class. So class as a hierarchized, or violence as a hierarchized expression of class is well established at this point in time. There's no clear moment when it really comes into being. It's very apparent. It's very apparently connected to historic assumptions about power. For example, kings and queens are allowed to torture and execute people who transgress state laws, but also class laws. So it's well established. And the idea here is that nobles and royals had honor innately. It's passed down from generation to generation. And the only reason you might need to fight is if that honor becomes questioned. And this is the context that we see for duels previously. On the other end of this class spectrum, we see how violence is seen as unnecessary in terms of scrapping, bar fights, domestic abuse, and that's usually attached to the lower classes. And it's constructed as a means of distinguishing classes. So the middle class don't really have a place in this yet. And they're trying to find a way to prove themselves as a distinct group. So what they decided would work in the context of Mensur is only performing Mensur in the context of ritual fraternal violence, so that way their violence was deemed necessary. So this distinguishes them from the lower classes who were shedding blood unnecessarily, but they also present themselves as more worthy because unlike nobles, they are now fighting for their honor. They are proving themselves. So therefore the respectability that is produced from the Mensur ritual is deemed more valuable because they didn't just get it from birth. And that's really a position that the middle class likes to take across the board. they're not overindulgent like the nobles. They don't get everything like the nobles do. They fight for it, but at the same time, they're a lot more respectable and restrained than the unruly lower classes. So this is a position that they carve out for themselves across the board, and they're using the body and these discourses on the body, and they're playing with them, they're twisting them to really carve out a space for themselves that presents them as more respectable. This also becomes a way for them to functionally gain power. One American newspaper at the time, which really digs into to what they call the archaic practice of Mensur, argues that this became a way of them to essentially get a pat on the back from the noble classes and access power. So this is really symbolized in what's called the Romneschmiss, which you can kind of see on this photo. It's a scar. It was usually on the face, so it's very prevalent, and that's quite significant because you cannot deny that someone has endured violence right here. And it also demonstrates that they didn't turn away from violence. It's on the face, it's visible, it's in a very significant spot. So therefore, both ideologically and functionally, Mensur is an attempt to bring this new middle class closer to ideals of respectability through discourses on the body and through how they presented their body. So next is gender. Gender, like class, had long been biologized. And it's this biologization that is now reaffirmed by science, which is on the uptick in the 19th century. There's the medicalization of gender, and with the medicalization and the scientific construction of gender, that we see the body becomes more legitimate, even though the social practices and performances of gender that were attached to these so-called scientific definitions are very much performed. So in the fraternal context, Mensur is a rite of passage. It takes place at a point in time where a young man is transitioning from childhood to adulthood, university. This is still very much the case today. So in order to fulfill this rite of passage, you really had to embody a very specific definition of masculinity, which can be 1834 encyclopedia describes the male as physically larger, stronger bones, coarser muscles, and mentally, however, by more courage based on greater feeling of strength and thus greater ability to perform the strenuous deeds of life. At the same time, he has a strong compulsion to assert himself in life with his powers and will as a more able sex in general. So we can see how the body is associated with this natural tendency towards violence and assertiveness. And so by practicing that in a very ritualized context, they're acknowledging that they are men, but they are also acknowledging that they are not, as the previous slide on class demonstrated, that they are not unruly. They are civilized men specifically who are able now to contribute to civilized, quote unquote, civilized European society. So functionally, it's symbolic as it's pulling, it is functionally, it's acting as a symbol in a rite of passage that demonstrates one's ability to conform to state ideals about the body, while also demonstrating, I completely lost my train of thought. So it's very much related to functional expressions of masculinity, in that by performing these ideals, they are now able to work within dialogues of the dichotomy between men and women, where they are now presenting themselves as complementary to women who are submissive, who are soft. And additionally, by demonstrating their courage, their honor, and their hardiness, they fit much more neatly into nation states as well as industrial capitalist economies. And so so here we see that the traits generally associated with Mensur, now symbolized by the reorienting, become social currency meant to grant certain people's access to national belonging. This gives way as well to nationalist exclusions, which are rooted in the pathologization of other bodies. As you can see in this image, or maybe not, as you can see in this image, it's exclusively male. Women were deemed too soft and too delicate to participate in Mensur. So it's very much inscribing social ideals about masculinity and femininity onto the body. But also it's relying, oh my gosh, it is also relying on historic dialogues about nation and belonging. One quote from a 1920 nationalist fraternity member argued that, that German Jews should not participate in Mensur because they are, quote unquote, wholly devoid of honor in the German sense of the word. And so not only is this a very telling glimpse of the rise of anti-Semitism, and can also be explained through the rise of anti-Semitism in the post-war period, it also relies on a longer dialogue about German Jewish identity. As David S. Katz identifies, in early modern England as well as Germany, there was the belief that Jewish men menstruated and therefore were associated with femininity. Additionally, this treats them with suspect, because blood is always treated as suspect. Additionally, femininity is treated as suspect. So this is one way of removing German Jews from a definition of honor. And that's the kind of mentality that really gave rise to, in part, these nationalist exclusions. I apologize for getting a little distracted there. There was noise out in the hallway. So in conclusion, these bodily discourses are ingrained into the cultural habitus and make gender and class a natural choice for the creation of respectable identity for this new emerging middle class. This will carry them to access power. Mensur as a practice and the Schmiss as a symbol act as currency in this relationship. However, this is disrupted in the First World War when we start to see mass violence as a result of modern warfare. So the romanticization of the scar looks frankly insensitive when soldiers are coming back with extreme bodily injury that most people had never seen in their entire lives. Additionally, the war as a modern war really questioned who participated in war. So one of the big boasting points of these fraternities is that they were raising the next generation of soldiers, civil servants, servants of the state, and that this type of training in their fraternity, i.e. the Mensur, would give them the skills needed to act as good civil servants and become respectable citizens of Germany. However, now with the First World War, we're starting to see that all bodies are bearing violence, surviving violence, and fighting for the state, even the bodies of animals. There was a mass mobilization of animals in the First World War, and it's no longer exclusively middle-class German men who are demonstrating their courage, their honor. Today, though, we can still see that Mensur and the scars function as a shorthand for masculine nationalist identity. There are a lot of characters in television and film who kind of bear this as a storytelling arc. So it's evident that we are using the body to tell stories about our past and to tell stories about our present, and that we should not remove these bodily discourses because they play an incredibly important role in how we construct certain identities and where we place those identities within narratives on the past. So this is my works cited and my primary sources. I did cut it a little short just because we are over time, or I was over time at least, but does anyone have any questions?